Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi, Herman and Corn. So while we're talking about some fascinating aircraft operating today, we talked about the electronic warfare and attack aircraft, the Boeing Router, and there was one that I've always been really intrigued to learn more about, at least to the extent that capabilities are in the public domain. But that's what I love about this stuff, is so much of, at least the basic level of information can be achieved through Google. So I remember reading that the IDF often deploys on intelligence missions a modified business jet. That seems like an intriguing idea. It's the Gulfstream G550, and in Israeli service it's called the Oron. And my question to ChatGPT was, we talked about the U-2 before, the fact that it's miraculously still flying, and it just seems an interesting idea to me. I mean, we associate business jets with luxury travel, not so much with military use. So why specifically would a business jet be a suitable aircraft for this? Because when we're talking about theatres of war, like let's say in Iran, where these assets might have to be up in the air for a long time, you tend to assume that military specific aircraft would have better refueling capabilities. And that maybe how much can you actually stuff into a business jet? I assume that these airborne assets are packed, every centimetre goes towards not comfortable seating, but space for operators and a lot of equipment. So I would have thought from a space standpoint specifically, that posed a constraint. But of course, Israel, needless to say, when it comes to everything intelligence related, knows exactly what it's doing, and I'm sure the choice is backed by a lot of reason for operational needs. So I'd love to know a little bit more about this, Herman and Corn. We've seen some fascinating examples of the US taking in, things like the F-35 and modifying it so much that the US argued that it was in breach of its agreement. So you can take something, even if it's the same aircraft nominally, it can often end up as something a very, very different beast entirely by the time it actually takes off. So I'd love to know a bit more about that, Herman and Corn. We've talked about electronic warfare aircraft. We've talked about the venerable U-2, and I'd love to learn more about business jets. Why is it that the IDF might be modifying this specifically for its needs? And how does it work? What would it have on board? What are its capabilities? Over to you two.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. I am Corn, and I am sitting here in our living room in Jerusalem, looking out at a surprisingly clear sky today.
And I am Herman Poppleberry. It is a beautiful day, Corn, but you know what they say about clear skies. They are perfect for high-altitude reconnaissance.
Spoken like a man who has been staring at flight tracking apps all morning. We have a really fascinating topic today. Our housemate Daniel sent us an audio note earlier. He was walking by the airport, I think, and it got him thinking about some of the more specialized aircraft we see in this part of the world. Specifically, he was asking about the Oron.
Oh, the Oron. That is a gem of engineering. It is one of those things where, if you saw it on the tarmac at Ben Gurion, you might just think it is a particularly fancy private jet for a tech billionaire. But underneath that sleek Gulfstream exterior, it is essentially a flying supercomputer.
Right, and that is exactly what Daniel was curious about. Why a business jet? When you think of military intelligence or electronic warfare, you usually picture these massive, lumbering planes like the old Boeing 707s or maybe those high-tech drones. But the Israeli Defense Forces have been leaning heavily into the Gulfstream G550 platform. Daniel wanted to know why this specific airframe is such a good fit for intelligence missions, and how they actually pack all that gear into a space designed for leather swivel chairs and champagne flutes.
It is a great question because it highlights a massive shift in how modern militaries think about airborne sensors. We should probably start with the basics of what the Oron actually is. It is the newest addition to the Noxian Squadron, which is the 122nd Squadron based at Nevatim Air Base. They have been flying Gulfstreams for a while, like the Itam and the Shavit, but the Oron is the pinnacle of that evolution. It was declared fully operational in August of 2023, and it has been incredibly busy ever since.
So let us tackle the big question first. Why a business jet? If I'm a military planner, why am I going to a company that makes luxury travel planes instead of, say, a dedicated military contractor for a brand new airframe?
It comes down to three main factors: altitude, endurance, and what we call operating economy. Think about a fighter jet for a second. It is fast, it is maneuverable, but it burns fuel like crazy and it cannot stay up for very long. Now think about a massive commercial airliner like a Boeing 747. It can carry a lot, but it is expensive to fly and it is a giant target.
And the Gulfstream sits right in the middle?
Exactly. The G550 is a beast in terms of performance. It can fly at altitudes of up to 51,000 feet. That is significantly higher than most commercial airliners, which usually cruise around 35,000 to 40,000 feet.
Wait, why does that altitude matter for intelligence? Is it just about staying out of the way of other planes?
Not at all. It is about the physics of sensors. If you are doing SIGINT, which is signals intelligence, or using radar to look at the ground, your horizon expands the higher you go. It is like standing on a stool versus standing on a skyscraper. At 50,000 feet, the Oron can see and hear much further into enemy territory without actually having to cross the border. It gives you a massive standoff capability, which is vital in a region where air defenses are becoming more sophisticated.
That makes sense. You are basically putting your antenna on the highest possible pole. What about the endurance? Daniel mentioned that these assets might need to stay in the air for a long time, especially if they are monitoring distant theaters.
That is where the business jet DNA really shines. These planes were designed to fly CEOs from New York to Tokyo non-stop. The Oron can stay airborne for 12 hours or more without refueling. When you combine that with its speed, it can get to a theater of operations quickly and then loiter there for an entire day. If you tried to do that with a dedicated military platform like a converted tactical bomber, you would be burning through maintenance hours and fuel at an unsustainable rate.
I also imagine there is a maintenance benefit. If you are using a Gulfstream, you are using an airframe that is used by hundreds of companies worldwide. Parts are available, the engines are well understood, and the reliability is world-class.
Precisely. The Rolls-Royce BR700 engines on that thing are incredibly reliable. From a logistics standpoint, it is much easier to keep a fleet of modified Gulfstreams running than it is to maintain a bespoke, one-of-a-kind military airframe. But the real magic, Corn, is not the plane itself. It is what the Israelis have done to the inside and the outside of it.
Right, because a standard G550 is designed for maybe 16 to 19 passengers in total luxury. The Oron looks a bit different. If you look at photos of it, it has these strange bulges and fairings. It looks like a normal plane that has developed some very specific aerodynamic tumors.
That is a very visceral way to put it, but you are not wrong. Those bulges are where the sensors live. The Oron is part of what they call the MARS program, which stands for Multi-Domain Airborne Reconnaissance and Surveillance. Most intelligence planes are specialized. You have one plane for listening to radio signals, another for taking high-resolution photos, and maybe another for ground scanning radar. The Oron does all of it at once.
All at once? How do they manage the data flow? That sounds like an incredible amount of information coming in simultaneously.
This is where the Israeli defense industry, specifically companies like Israel Aerospace Industries and Elta, really flex their muscles. They have developed these AESA radars, which are active electronically scanned arrays. Unlike old radars that have a dish that spins around, these are flat panels that can steer their beams electronically at the speed of light. They can track thousands of targets on the ground, in the air, and at sea all at the same time.
So it is not just looking at one thing. It is creating a real-time map of everything moving in a massive area.
Exactly. And it is not just raw data. The Oron uses artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms on board to process that data before it even reaches the human operators. It can distinguish between a civilian truck and a mobile missile launcher automatically. It flags the things that matter so the operators do not get overwhelmed by the noise. This is what the IDF calls the digital cloud or network-centric warfare.
That leads back to one of Daniel's points. He asked about the space for operators. If the plane is packed with sensors and computers, where do the people go? In a business jet, space is at a premium.
It is a tight fit, but it is highly optimized. Instead of luxury sofas, the cabin is lined with high-tech workstations. You have rows of operators with multiple large screens wearing headsets analyzing the data in real time. One of the breakthroughs with the Oron is that it is designed to be a multi-domain command center. It is not just collecting data to send back to headquarters. The people on the plane can actually manage the battle from the air.
That is a huge shift. So they are essentially acting as a miniature high-speed AWACS, but with much more diverse intelligence gathering capabilities.
Right. A WACS, or Airborne Warning and Control System, is usually focused on the air. The Oron is looking at everything. It is looking at maritime threats, it is looking at ground movements, and it is listening to the electromagnetic spectrum. It is providing what they call a common operating picture. If there is a unit on the ground or a ship at sea, the Oron can feed them target data directly.
I am curious about the transition from the older platforms. We used to see these massive Boeing 707s doing this work. Why move away from the big wings to these smaller jets? Is it just cost? Or has the technology shrunk enough that you do not need a giant plane anymore?
It is a bit of both. We have seen a massive miniaturization of electronics over the last 20 years. What used to take up a whole room of server racks can now fit into something the size of a microwave. But there is also a tactical advantage to the smaller size. A Gulfstream has a much smaller radar cross-section than a Boeing 707. It is harder to detect and track. It is also more agile. If it needs to descend quickly or change its flight path to avoid a threat, it can do that much more effectively than a converted airliner.
It also feels like there is a bit of a psychological or even political component here. A Gulfstream looks less threatening than a massive military plane, right? I mean, it is still obviously a military asset when it is covered in sensors, but it can operate out of smaller civilian airports if it needs to.
That is a good point. It has a much smaller footprint. It does not need a massive runway like a fully loaded heavy jet. This gives the IDF more flexibility in where they deploy it from. And let us not forget the speed. The G550 can fly at Mach 0.85. That is fast. It can get from one end of the country to the other, or out over the Mediterranean in a matter of minutes.
I want to go back to the sensors for a second, because Daniel mentioned the U-2 in his prompt. He was comparing the Oron to that classic spy plane. The U-2 is famous for its cameras and its extreme altitude. How does the Oron compare to something like the U-2 or the newer drones like the Global Hawk?
It is a different philosophy. The U-2 and the Global Hawk are great for what we call strategic reconnaissance. They go very high, they stay up for a long time, and they take incredible pictures or scan huge areas. But they are often limited in terms of human interaction. A drone has no one on board. If the satellite link goes down, or if there is a sudden change in the tactical situation, there is a delay in how the data is processed and acted upon.
Whereas the Oron has the analysts right there, in the air, looking at the data as it happens.
Exactly. Having 10 or 12 highly trained intelligence officers on board means you can make decisions in seconds. They can see a target pop up, verify it, and pass the coordinates to a fighter jet or a ground unit immediately. It shortens the sensor to shooter loop, as they say in the military. It is the difference between getting a report an hour later and having a live play-by-play of the battlefield.
And I suppose that is why the Israelis call it the Oron, which roughly translates to a great light or vision. It is a vessel carrying the most valuable thing in modern warfare, information.
Precisely. And it is worth noting that this is not just an Israeli trend. The United States is doing something similar with the EA-37B Compass Call, which is also based on the Gulfstream airframe. The United Kingdom uses the Global 6000, another business jet, for its surveillance roles. The world is moving toward these high-performance, medium-sized jets for special missions.
It is interesting that the business jet industry has inadvertently created the perfect platform for 21st century warfare. They spent decades optimizing for speed, altitude, and range for the ultra-wealthy, and it turns out those are exactly the specs you need for a high-tech spy plane.
It is the ultimate dual-use technology. But you know, Corn, there is a challenge with this. When you pack that much electronics into a small space, you run into two big problems: heat and power.
Oh, I hadn't thought of that. All those computers and radar arrays must generate a massive amount of heat.
A staggering amount. If you have ever been in a server room, you know how loud and hot it gets. Now imagine that in a pressurized tube at 50,000 feet, the engineers at Gulfstream and Alta had to completely redesign the cooling systems. They use liquid cooling and massive heat exchangers that are often integrated into those external bulges. They have to dump all that heat into the thin air outside without creating too much drag.
And the power? A standard private jet probably does not have the electrical output to run a massive AESA radar.
Not even close. They have to modify the engines to drive much more powerful generators. The Oron effectively becomes a flying power plant. Every watt of energy has to be accounted for. It is a delicate balance because the more power you draw from the engines for the electronics, the less you have for thrust and fuel efficiency.
It really is a feat of integration. I mean, thinking about what Daniel said, it is easy to look at it and just see a plane. But when you realize that every square inch of that interior is an optimized piece of a larger system, it changes your perspective. It is not just a plane carrying a camera. The plane is the sensor.
That is the best way to describe it. The airframe and the electronics are one single entity. That is why the Oron is so much more capable than the older Shavit or ITOM models that the IDF used before. Those were great, but the Oron represents a level of integration where the radar, the signals intelligence, and the electro-optical sensors all talk to each other through a single AI-driven interface.
So if the radar sees something suspicious, it can automatically tell the cameras to zoom in on that spot, while the signals intelligence suite listens for any radio traffic coming from that exact location.
You nailed it. It is called cross-queuing. It removes the human error of trying to coordinate three different systems. The plane does the heavy lifting of finding the target, and the humans do the high-level work of deciding what it means and what to do about it.
I think one of the most interesting things for me is the endurance factor. Daniel mentioned the theaters of war like Iran. If you are flying from Israel, you have to cross several countries or go around them. Having that 12-hour loiter time means you can spend 6 or 7 hours actually on station, watching and listening, and still have plenty of fuel to get home.
And you can do it without needing a massive aerial refueling fleet. While the Oron can be refueled in the air, its natural range is so long that it does not always need to. That simplifies mission planning immensely. You do not have to coordinate a tanker to meet you over the ocean just to keep your eyes in the sky.
Let us talk about the misconception that these are just for high-level surveillance. Could an Oron be used in a more active role? Like, could it actually jam enemy communications or participate in electronic warfare?
Absolutely. While its primary role is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, the line between listening and talking in the electromagnetic spectrum is very thin. If you have the power and the antennas to listen to a signal from hundreds of miles away, you likely have the capability to interfere with it too. The Oron is part of a broader family of electronic warfare assets. In a conflict, it would be the brain of the operation, identifying where the enemy's radars and communication nodes are, and then either jamming them itself or telling other assets, like F-35 fighters, exactly where to strike.
It is like the quarterback of the Air Force.
That is a perfect analogy. It sees the whole field, it calls the plays, and it has the best view of the defense. And because it is flying so high, it is very hard for the defense to sack the quarterback.
So, looking forward, do you think we will see the end of large intelligence planes? Is the era of the converted 707 or the DC-8 over?
For most roles, yes. The only reason you would still want a large plane is if you need to carry a massive amount of people or a truly gargantuan radar dish that just cannot be shrunk down. But for the vast majority of modern missions, these business jet platforms are the future. They are more survivable, more efficient, and frankly, they are more capable because they can fly higher and faster.
It is also worth noting how this affects the people who fly them. I was reading a report a while back about how the fatigue levels are different on these newer planes. Even though the space is tighter, the cabin altitude is lower.
Oh, that is a great point, Corn. Most commercial planes are pressurized to about 8,000 feet. The Gulfstream G550 has a much better pressurization system. Even when it is at 50,000 feet, the cabin feels like it is at about 4,000 feet.
That makes a huge difference for the operators, right? If you are sitting there for 10 hours, you are going to be much more alert if your body thinks it is at a lower altitude.
Precisely. You get more oxygen, you are less dehydrated, and your cognitive performance stays higher. When your job is to analyze complex data and make life or death decisions, that cabin altitude is not just a luxury, it is a mission-critical feature. It is another reason why the business jet is superior to a converted older military plane.
It is funny how these things connect. You start with a plane designed for comfort, and it ends up being a tool for better military intelligence because it keeps the analysts from getting a headache.
It is all connected. The engineering that goes into making a billionaire comfortable also happens to make a soldier more effective.
So, we have talked about the why and the how. Let us look at the big picture for a second. The Oron was delivered to the IDF in early 2021, and it took a few years to become fully operational with all its systems. We are now in February of 2026. How has its presence changed the landscape here?
Well, without getting into classified details, you can see the results in the speed of the IDF's responses. In recent years, the ability to detect threats far from Israel's borders and respond to them before they even reach the frontier has improved dramatically. The Oron is a big part of that. It allows for a proactive defense rather than a reactive one. It is about knowing what the other side is doing before they even do it.
It is that concept of information superiority. If you know more than the other guy, and you know it faster, you have already won half the battle.
Exactly. And the Oron is the ultimate tool for that. It is a testament to the idea that in modern warfare, the most powerful weapon is not a missile or a bomb, but a well-processed bit of data.
I think that really answers Daniel's question. It is not just about a pretty plane. It is about a highly optimized, high-altitude, long-endurance platform that keeps its operators sharp and its sensors clear. It is the perfect marriage of civilian aerospace engineering and cutting-edge military technology.
It really is. And I have to say, every time I see one of those Gulfstreams taking off from the airport, I can't help but wonder if it is just a CEO going to a meeting or if it is an Oron heading out on a mission to keep the skies safe.
Probably a bit of both in this part of the world. Well, that was a deep dive. Herman, you really know your avionics.
I try, Corn, I try. It is hard not to get excited about this stuff. The engineering is just so elegant.
It is. And for those of you listening, if you found this as fascinating as we did, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and helps us keep doing these deep dives into the weird and wonderful prompts that our friend Daniel and our listeners send in.
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. And if you want to get in touch or see our back catalog of over 600 episodes, head over to myweirdprompts.com. We have an RSS feed there and a contact form if you have a prompt of your own.
Maybe you have a question about another specialized aircraft or something completely different. We love the variety.
We certainly do.
Well, I think that wraps it up for today. Thanks for joining us on this mission.
It has been a pleasure. This has been My Weird Prompts.
Stay curious, everyone. We will see you in the next one.
Bye for now.
Goodbye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.